a joy and an honor. He's been a wonderful friend of the program. The laureate Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, yes, at Columbia Business School, definitive on economics and redefining the Greek letter epsilon long ago and far away was for Sanford Grossman as well in the fancy math of the moment. Joe Stiglitz, let me give you the real world math. Gary, Indiana, fanciest city in the world for economics, the home of Joe Stiglitz and Paul Samuelson. Gary, Indiana went from a pandemic 19% unemployment down to 7% unemployment. That indicates the inequalities of a strange economy. How great is the inequality in this 2021?
Well, the pandemic both exposed and exacerbated the inequalities. We were slated for a very K-shaped recovery with those at the top who had done well doing even better and those at the bottom doing more poorly. The kind of numbers that you cited suggest that the kind of very strong economic recovery act that was passed, the $1.9 trillion, is beginning to have some effect and mitigating at least some of that fear of this very K-shaped recovery. It's still there. It's still very clear that in terms of wealth, those at the top have done very well, and those at the bottom are more in debt, as not only the visible debt, but the invisible debt that many of them have not been able to pay their rent for a year.
Professor Stiglitz, I quote you often in the acclaimed Stiglitz essays of long ago on the little g, that what matters is the growth rate. You're acclaimed at this within your teaching in many different spheres. Great. Can we grow our way out of these debt and deficit? Should we have confidence and rely on the Stiglitz little g to help us get out of this fiscal mess?
Yes. I mean, one way of looking at it is just a little bit of history. At the end of World War II, our debt-GDP ratio was 130%. And then there was a bipartisan consensus led by President Eisenhower, a Republican, that we ought to spend heavily on infrastructure, education, R&D. And lo and behold, in a couple of decades, our debt-GDP ratio was down to under 50%. So yes, you can grow out of the high levels of debt that we have. And, you know, right now we're expecting to have very strong growth for this year. We're actually, most forecasts suggest that at the end of this year, we will be better than we were projected to be before the pandemic.
Yeah, and Professor, we're talking about the US economy. Of course, we're not talking about other parts of the world like India, like Brazil. You've advocated for the IP waiver that this administration is pushing through at the moment, or at least trying to achieve with partners over at the WTO. Why do you think that's the right approach?
This is a pandemic. The definition of a pandemic is that it's global. And this particular pandemic is a kind of danger because it keeps mutating. And we don't want a fertile field for those mutations, say in India. We want this disease to be put under control. Nowhere's going to be safe until everywhere is safe. And that's why it's really important to get the vaccine out there as quickly as possible. Now, a major impediment is access to intellectual property. A whole variety of access is needed. The principle has been long established. It was established almost 2 decades ago in the midst of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The question is how to facilitate it. There's an urgency here. Yep. And that's what the waiver is about. It's not changing the basic framework. There was always the right to compulsory licenses since that HIV/AIDS. The question is how to make it happen quickly. And that's what the temporary IP waiver is all about.
Dr. Fauci has doubts about that. He thinks that this could be an unwarranted, unwelcome distraction, that it could take until the end of 22, early 23 to transfer the technology. And then, Professor, we'd have to talk about expertise as well. The starting position of this debate, everybody agrees with what you said. We need to help the rest of the world. And even the most selfish individual has to acknowledge there is positive externalities associated with that. So before we even have this debate, it's done. That's done. We need to help the rest of the world. But, Professor, it's how we help them more quickly. Do you acknowledge there are other issues that need to be tackled and that this could become an unwelcome distraction for the other nations, that we could be doing more to loosen up the strings elsewhere?
Well, those sound like the talking points from the drug companies, but the point is that the drug companies in the developing countries, emerging markets, do have the capacity. A barrier to their expanding that capacity is the concerns about intellectual property. Several companies in South Africa and India are already producing even the more advanced kinds of vaccines, let alone the simpler kinds of vaccines. And it is really intellectual property that is one of the barriers. Now, another barrier that is related to the WTO waiver is allowing companies to more easily export their products. Under the standard WTO framework, you can get a compulsory license that allows you to manufacture for domestic use, but makes it more difficult to export. But in today's world of global supply chains, where even the ingredients in a vaccine may be made in several countries, the barriers to export are a major barrier to expanding the world's global supply. So that's why it's imperative to have a temporary waiver of all these restrictions.
Professor, there is a question, though, about the economic incentive for companies. And yes, there is this concern by pharmaceutical companies that this removes the economic incentive. However, there are some who argue this could pull them back from innovating, from working harder to come up with new drugs to combat whatever new disease comes our way. What's your response to this, that the economic incentive is that much lower for the pharmaceutical companies?
That's absolute nonsense. I mean, first of all, let's be clear. The basic research on which these vaccines is based was financed by the governments around the world. Secondly, the expansion of the production and the development of these particular vaccines received enormous government support, not only from the United States, but from other countries. The amounts of money that the drug companies are going to get on these vaccines are going to be, enormous returns, well in excess of any normal return. What we're talking about here is whether they'll get, say, 10,000% return on their investments or 1,000% return. 1,000% return is enough incentive to make them undertake that research. I don't worry about that.
Well, there's also a question, this dovetails into the larger infrastructure spending that Joe Biden has proposed. And just quickly here, are you in the camp of Janet Yellen that taxes should be raised substantially on companies? And if so, why is it not just sufficient to do deficit spending, which does not seem to have had a problem for this country?
Well, I do agree that eventually we need to correct our distorted tax system, which in terms of the percentage of GDP that is raised in taxes is insufficient to finance a 21st century economy where you need infrastructure, research, education, a whole host of public needs to make a well-functioning economy and society. We also have a distorted tax system, which is less progressive than other countries, less progressive than it should be, particularly given the enormous increase in inequality over the last 4 decades. So the question is really one of timing. The basic law of economics is scarcity of resources, and we've underutilized our resources. We have some capacity to expand production, but eventually we will reach capacity constraints. And then we will have to decide how our resources get allocated. And that's when the issues of taxes become germane.
I won't get into a debate about the efficient allocation of resources with a Nobel laureate, so we'll leave it there. Professor,
oh,
it's
you've
good to
done
catch
that
up.
before.
Professor Stiglitz, Columbia Business School University professor.
Thank you.